They were mothers, wives, friends, ordinary women in ordinary lives. But somewhere along the line, that changed. Today, they live behind bars, stripped of names, reduced to numbers, waiting for the state to finish what they started. Out of thousands on death row, only a handful are women. But their crimes cut through society like glass. These are not easy stories. They leave behind broken families, unanswered questions, and communities that will never be the same. These are 6 women on death row in 2025. Not myths, not monsters, but real people who crossed the line. Disclaimer. Before we begin, a very important note. This video contains discussions of real crimes, including violence and crimes against children, that may be disturbing to some viewers. Our goal here is not to glorify or sensationalize these acts, but to shed light on the reality of what happened, the lives impacted, and the justice that followed. Please watch with care and with respect for the victims and their families. They say a uniform should stand for protection, for trust, for duty. But on a quiet night in March of 1995, a woman wearing that very uniform shattered everything it was meant to symbolize. Once, Antoinette Frank was a face people trusted, a police officer in the New Orleans Police Department. She smiled in her academy photo, wore her badge with pride, and swore an oath to serve. But beneath that badge lived a storm, one that no one fully saw coming. And when it finally broke, it left behind a trail of blood that still lingers in the memory of New Orleans. Antoinette's journey to becoming an officer wasn't clean. She lied on her application. She failed psychological evaluations. But the department was short on officers, and they let her in anyway. She wasn't a terrible cop at first. She even earned Officer of the Month. But something about her unsettled people. She was detached, unpredictable, and never seemed to understand the weight of what she'd sworn to do. And then came Rogers Lacaze, a drug dealer, a man with a history of violence, the kind of man cops were supposed to arrest, not fall for, but Frank did. She called it helping him turn his life around, but the truth was darker. She introduced him to fellow officers as a trainee, or her nephew, as they pulled motorists over in a squad car and robbed them. Bit by bit, the line between protector and predator vanished. Then came the night that sealed her name in infamy. March 4th, 1995. The Kimman restaurant in New Orleans East had closed for the night. Inside, the Vu family, hardworking, kind, and familiar with Frank, were cleaning up. Officer Ronald Williams II, a respected cop, was working off-duty security to provide for his young family. Antoinette had worked security there before. She was trusted, familiar. So when she returned that night with Lacaze, no one suspected they were looking at death. Chauvu, one of the sisters, felt something was wrong. Antoinette had already been by earlier, and now, walking in again, she gave off an energy that made Chow uneasy. As Chow tried to secure the money in the kitchen, Frank used a key she'd stolen to unlock the door. And just like that, Death walked in wearing a badge. Lacaze moved fast. He slipped behind Officer Williams and shot him in the neck. The bullet severed his spinal cord. Ronald didn't even have time to draw his weapon. He collapsed onto the restaurant floor, the air leaving his lungs in a single, broken sound. More shots followed, cold, measured. Officer Williams was executed by someone he probably still thought was a fellow cop just minutes before. The Vu siblings panicked. Chow and the others ran into the walk-in cooler, the heavy door shutting them into darkness. Their breaths were shallow, their bodies frozen in terror. Outside, Frank and Lacaze hunted for cash. When 21-year-old Harvu begged for her life, Antoinette shot her 3 times. Her 17-year-old brother Kwong was pistol-whipped, then shot 6 times. 2 young lives gone in the same place where laughter and the scent of home-cooked meals usually lived. They fled into the night, but the story didn't end there. It twisted into something even more chilling. As the 911 calls went out, Frank heard the dispatch on her radio. Officer down at Kim An. She borrowed a patrol car and returned, not as a fugitive, but as a cop answering the call she helped create. She stepped through the front door in uniform, with the cool composure of someone who believed she could outsmart the world. Chow saw her and didn't see safety. She saw the woman who had just murdered her brother and sister. She ran, not toward Frank, but straight to the arriving officers, screaming her name. Frank tried to play the role. She identified herself as an officer, calm and composed, as if she hadn't just executed 3 people. But the mask slipped fast. She and Lacaze were arrested. 3 counts of first-degree murder. For Officer Ronald Williams, for Ha Vu, and for Kwong Vu. At trial, it didn't take long for the jury to see through her. 22 minutes. That's all they needed to return a guilty verdict. 22 minutes to weigh a life and find it unredeemable. The next day, just 45 minutes to sentence her to death. She became the only woman on Louisiana's death row. But her darkness didn't begin at Kim An. In 1993, her father disappeared. 2 years later, after she was sentenced, police found a human skull beneath her house, a bullet hole in it. They believed it was her father. She was never charged. She didn't need to be. She was already on the path to die behind razor wire. Years turned into decades. Her legal team tried everything: appeals, petitions, claims of trauma, and procedural error. But the facts never changed. 3 people dead. One of them is a cop. The Vu family carried the weight of that night forever. Their restaurant survived hurricanes, floods, the changing of time itself. But they never forgot Ha and Kwong. Officer Ronald Williams's name rests on a national memorial, carved in stone. Frank sits alone on death row, the only woman in Louisiana awaiting execution. The badge that once shielded her now chains her to what she became. And perhaps what makes this story pierce the soul is not just the brutality of the crime, it's the betrayal of the symbol. A police officer, a trusted figure, turning predator. It forces you to ask, who do we really trust when even the uniform can lie? How do communities heal when the person sworn to protect them is the one who pulls the trigger? But betrayal doesn't always wear a badge. Sometimes it wears a smile. Sometimes it shows up at your door, pretending to be your friend, your ally, your lifeline. And when you least expect it, it turns your world into a nightmare. The next woman on death row didn't need a weapon to earn trust. She used charm, she used warmth, and she used it all to lure another woman into a trap she would never escape. Her name is Linda Carty. She smiled easily, spoke gently, and carried herself with the warmth of someone who could have been your neighbor, your friend, or even the woman who volunteers at the church bake sale. But behind that disarming charm, Linda Carty hid a secret so twisted it would shake her community to its core. Unlike the hardened killers you expect to hear about, Linda didn't wield her violence like a blunt weapon. She wrapped it in trust. And when she finally struck, it was against the most vulnerable soul of all, a young mother and her newborn baby. Linda was born on the island of St. Kitts and came to the United States chasing a better life. She studied pharmacology at the University of Houston. She'd been a teacher, a mother, and for a while, a government informant working with the Drug Enforcement Administration. But her past wasn't clean. She'd impersonated an FBI agent, stolen cars, and made deals with dangerous people. And when she got too close to the underbelly of Houston's drug world, she started telling people something strange, that she was pregnant, that she was about to have a baby boy, but she wasn't. On the night of May 16th, 2001, that lie became a weapon. Prosecutors later said Linda gathered 3 accomplices and targeted 20-year-old Joanna Rodriguez, who had just given birth to her son 4 days earlier. In the still darkness, they broke into Joanna's apartment, storming through the door like shadows with a single plan: take the baby. Joanna's husband tried to fight back, but the intruders overpowered him. They tied Joanna up, forced her into a car, and drove off with both her and her newborn son. Linda had told people she was going to bring home a baby. She just didn't say how. Hours later, police found Joanna's lifeless body in the trunk of a car. She'd suffocated, bound, and helpless. Her newborn son, miraculously, was found alive in another vehicle. Nearby, investigators uncovered baby clothes, a car seat, and traces of Linda's fingerprints in both cars. And this is where the mask began to slip. Before the crime, Linda had been telling neighbors she was pregnant, despite never showing a single sign of it. One woman remembered sitting in her car with Linda, staring at an empty car seat, and hearing her say the baby would be born tomorrow. She called her husband and told him the same lie. She even told a storage clerk the child had already been born. It was a performance, one carefully layered to make the lie feel real when the crime finally unfolded. When police reached her by phone, she didn't run. She calmly told them where they might find her rented car and her daughter's car, never realizing she'd just led them straight to the crime scene. Her prints were there, the baby was there, and Joanna was gone. At trial, the evidence stacked up like bricks. Phone records placed Linda in contact with her co-defendants during the kidnapping. Witnesses testified about her false pregnancy claims, and perhaps most damning, Joanna's final hours were tied directly to the cars Linda had access to. Linda insisted she was framed, pointing fingers at her co-defendants, claiming they had set her up because of her work as a DEA informant. But those same men testified against her. They got prison sentences. She got the death penalty. But Linda's case became more than a courtroom story. It became an international storm. Because Linda held British citizenship, the UK government argued that Texas violated international law by not notifying their consulate when she was arrested. British officials claimed they could have changed the outcome had they been involved from the beginning. Lawyers accused Linda's trial attorney of failing her, barely meeting with her, not calling witnesses, and not fighting hard enough to save her life. The appeals stretched for years. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, even the Supreme Court of the United States. But every door closed. Her execution date hasn't been set, but the clock on death row never stops ticking. Today, Linda sits in Mountain View Unit, the only British woman on death row in the US, still claiming innocence. Her story has been told in documentaries, news specials, and even primetime British television. Supporters say she was framed. Prosecutors say the evidence is clear. But one fact doesn't change. A young mother lost her life that night, and her baby grew up without her. It's a story that leaves you asking, what kind of desperation drives someone to plot a crime like this? Was it cold calculation, a fractured mind, or something far more sinister? How does a woman who once taught children end up tied to one of Texas's most haunting murder cases? But evil doesn't always wear the same face. Sometimes it comes wrapped in a badge, like Antoinette Frank. Sometimes it comes smiling, like Linda Carty. And sometimes it hides behind the walls of a picture-perfect home, where the danger isn't a stranger at the door. It's the woman already inside. The next woman on death row didn't need to lure a stranger or break into a house. She lived in one. She was a wife and a mother, and the people who trusted her the most never saw it coming. Her name is Kerry Lynn Dalton. She wasn't the type to blend into the background. Kerry Lynn Dalton had a sharp presence, bold, outspoken, and impossible to ignore. But what truly made her case unforgettable wasn't the way she carried herself. It was what prosecutors claimed she did one summer night in 1988. A night, they said, turned a quiet mobile home in Live Oak Springs, California, into a scene straight out of a nightmare. But here's the part that rattled even seasoned investigators. There was no blood, no weapon, no crime scene evidence, not even a body. And yet, she ended up on death row. Kerry was born in January 1960 and lived a life far from perfect, entangled in drugs, unstable relationships, and chaos that seemed to orbit around her like a storm. On June 26, 1988, according to prosecutors, Kerry and three others, Mark Lee Tompkins, Cheryl Ann Baker, and a man known only as George, targeted 23-year-old Irene Louise May, known to friends as Melanie. They said the group believed Melanie had stolen jewelry from Kerry, and in a drug-fueled frenzy, they allegedly tied her up, beat her with a cast-iron frying pan, stabbed her with a knife, and injected her with battery acid. Then, they claimed they disposed of her body. But when a sheriff's deputy responded to that same mobile home that night, not for a murder, but a burglary call, what he found didn't fit the story that would later unfold in court. No signs of a struggle, no blood, no body, nothing to indicate the horrific violence prosecutors would later describe in such chilling detail. He did, however, note that the resident was high on methamphetamine and mentally unstable. No weapons were recovered. No physical evidence ever surfaced. Years passed before Kerry was arrested on May 14, 1992. And from that moment, the case took on a strange, almost surreal quality. Because in court, the foundation of the prosecution's story wasn't evidence. It was words, witness statements, rumors, hearsay. On the sixth day of her trial, the presiding judge, Thomas J. Whelan, did something you rarely see in a capital case. He openly told the courtroom there was a real question as to whether a crime had even happened. He stated for the record that no body had ever been found and that there was conflicting circumstantial evidence, some pointing to a homicide, some suggesting Melanie May might still be alive. Imagine that. A woman facing death for a crime that might not have even taken place. Even the jury was reminded of this. When the prosecutor referred to Melanie as deceased, the judge stopped him, telling the jurors that it was their job to decide whether or not she was in fact dead. It wasn't a detail, it was the heart of the case. Kerry never confessed. In fact, the so-called confessions that the prosecution presented were based entirely on the testimony of their own investigator, repeating what he claimed others told him. No recording, no direct words from Kerry, just stories passed from one person to another. And still, it was enough to convince 12 jurors that Kerry should die for what they said she did. Kerry accused the prosecutor, Jeff Dusek, of lying. She stared down the courtroom and said the thing that made her the angriest wasn't the accusation itself. It was the dishonesty she believed was behind it. And yet the jury's foreman would later say Their decision came down to the type of murder it was: a brutal, sadistic killing, even though not one drop of physical evidence existed to prove it happened at all. She was sentenced to death, and for years, Kerry sat on death row, one of the few women in California to receive that sentence. But in 2019, the Supreme Court of California vacated her death sentence. The conviction remained, but the ultimate punishment was stripped away. Today, Kerry is serving life at Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. Melanie May's body has never been found. No forensic evidence has ever surfaced. And the questions that haunted that trial still echo decades later. Can you truly sentence someone to die when no one can even prove a murder took place? Is it justice, or a story that spun too far out of control? Some people believe Kerry is a cold-blooded killer who got exactly what she deserved. Others believe she's the product of a case built on sand, a woman punished for a crime that exists only in whispers. And perhaps what makes this case so haunting is not what we know, but what we'll never be able to prove. But while Kerry's fate was shaped by what couldn't be proven, the next woman's story is the opposite. Her trial wasn't built on whispers. It was built on ashes. A mother, a carer, a secret no one saw coming until it was too late. If you've made it this far into the story, then you know this isn't just another true crime case. These are real lives, real people, real consequences. If you want to keep uncovering the darkness with us, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. It's free, and it helps us bring more stories like this to light. And while you're at it, give this video a like so more people can find it too. Let's keep going, because this case is about to get even darker. She came across as a mother, someone you'd see in the aisles of a grocery store, pushing a cart, blending into everyday life. But behind that familiar smile was a history of cruelty and control that no one truly saw coming. Kimberly Cargill had spent years weaving a storm around everyone closest to her. But it was the night of June 18th, 2010, when that storm reached its breaking point, and a woman named Cherry Walker, gentle, kind, and vulnerable, would never make it home again. Born in Mississippi in 1966, Kimberly carried darkness from an early age. By 11, she'd experienced trauma no child should. But what began as suffering turned into something colder, something she unleashed on the people who loved her the most. 3 marriages, 4 sons, and a string of violent outbursts that grew more dangerous with each passing year. Her ex-husbands remembered fists flying, fire being set out of rage, and children locked in rooms for hours at a time. Her sons remembered fear, real, bone-deep fear, and even her own mother wasn't spared from her hands around her throat when she got angry. Kimberly's world was built on control, and anyone who threatened it paid the price. By 2010, the walls were closing in. Child Protective Services had stepped in after repeated allegations of abuse. 2 of her boys were already in the care of relatives, and she was facing an upcoming custody hearing that could take the last bit of control she had away from her. But there was one more problem, one witness: Cherry Walker. Cherry was 39 years old. She had developmental challenges, but she was sweet and trusting, and she babysat Kimberly's son. To Kimberly, Cherry was a liability, someone who could speak up in court and confirm what was really happening inside her home. And when Cherry was served a subpoena to testify at that hearing, Kimberly made a decision: not to fight in court, not to clean up her life, but to erase the one person she feared could take everything away from her. She told Cherry she'd help her hide from testifying. It sounded like kindness to a frightened woman, but what Kerry didn't know was that she was walking straight into a trap. That night, Kimberly picked her up under the pretense of dinner. What happened next is still a chilling mystery. There was no gunshot, no knife, no screaming neighbors, just silence. And somewhere along that drive, Kerry stopped breathing. Kimberly claimed it was a seizure, that she tried to give CPR, that she panicked. But the autopsy told a different story. The forensic pathologist concluded Kerry died of asphyxiation. The way she died pointed to violence, deliberate and terrifying. And then came the fire. 8 to 10 miles from Kerry's apartment, on a quiet rural road, Kimberly left her body, doused it in lighter fluid, and set it alight. She thought the flames would erase the evidence. She thought it would all disappear with the smoke. But the next day, someone driving down that same road saw something, a burnt figure on the side of the road. It would take 4 days to put a name to the remains, but when they did, it shocked the entire community. Within weeks, investigators began connecting the dots. Kimberly's custody battle, the subpoena, her history of violence, and the inconsistencies in her story. By July 31st, 2010, she was charged with capital murder. But even in handcuffs, Kimberly didn't back down. She insisted Kerry had died of natural causes, that she'd made a terrible mistake, but not a murderous one. The trial began in May 2012 in Smith County, Texas. It was packed. Kerry's family, Kimberly's children, her ex-husbands, expert witnesses. The air in that courtroom was heavy, not just with grief, but with a sense of reckoning. One by one, people took the stand. A forensic psychiatrist testified Kimberly had borderline personality disorder with narcissistic and antisocial traits. She wasn't confused. She wasn't lost in a fog of mental illness. She knew right from wrong, and she chose wrong. Her own children painted the picture of what life was like behind closed doors: the choking, the fear, the locks, the cruelty. The jury listened, they watched, and in the end, they delivered their verdict: guilty of capital murder. On May 31st, 2012, the same woman who once controlled everyone around her sat in silence as the jury unanimously recommended death. A week later, the judge made it official. Kimberly Cargill was sentenced to die by lethal injection. Appeals came, and they went, one after another. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals rejected her appeals. The Supreme Court of the United States dismissed her case. Nothing could undo what she'd done, or bring Kerry Walker back. Kimberly waits on death row at the Patrick O'Daniel unit. A mother, a killer, a woman whose world unraveled because of the truth she tried to silence. And yet, if Kimberly's story was one of control turned to ashes, the next woman's story is something else entirely. A story where love, trust, and fire collided in ways no one saw coming. Some crimes live in whispers, others burn their way into history. And Michelle Scott's story is one that still smolders. She wasn't a stranger to fire. In fact, fire had followed her for years. But on one dark August night in 2008, that fire didn't just take a house, it took a child, and it left behind a trail of secrets, insurance money, and a mother the world would soon call a killer. This is the story of Christy Michelle Scott. She was 30 years old, a wife, a mother of 2 boys, and on the outside, she lived what seemed like an ordinary life in the small town of Russellville, Alabama. But beneath the surface, Christy had a complicated past. She'd lived through multiple mysterious house fires, fires that at the time, no one could quite explain. In 2005 alone, her own house caught fire twice in 1 week. Arson was never proven, but it was never forgotten either. Then came the night of August 16th, 2008. At around 2:30 a.m., flames tore through Christy's home. She and her younger son made it out alive, but 6-year-old Mason Scott, a sweet little boy with autism, never made it out of his bedroom. His small, lifeless body was found after firefighters managed to put out the blaze. The smoke detector had been removed. He'd been drugged with cough syrup, and the autopsy showed soot in his lungs, meaning Mason was still alive when the fire began. He had breathed in that smoke. He had felt the flames closing in. Investigators started to piece everything together. Christy had purchased a $100,000 life insurance policy on Mason just 12 hours before the fire. She'd also taken out additional policies months earlier, and this wasn't a panicked mother's tragedy. This was cold, calculated murder for money. A month after the fire, Christy turned herself in. On September 30th, 2008, she was officially charged with her son's murder. But in court, she insisted she was innocent. She said she didn't know how the fire started. She said she loved her son. The trial began on June 12, 2009. Prosecutors painted a devastating picture: a mother who valued a payout more than her child's life. They showed the timeline of the insurance policy, the removed smoke detector, and the evidence of prior fires. And they reminded the jury that Mason's last moments weren't peaceful. He died struggling to breathe, trapped in his room as the house burnt. On July 8, 2009, the jury found Christy guilty of 3 counts of capital murder: the murder of a child under 14, murder during arson, and murder for financial gain. A sentence of death or life without parole was on the table. When it came time to recommend a sentence, 7 jurors voted for life. 5 voted for death. Normally, that would have meant life in prison. But back then, Alabama allowed judges to override the jury's recommendation. And on August 5th, 2009, Judge Terry Dempsey did exactly that. He overruled the jury and sentenced Christy Michelle Scott to death by lethal injection. In his words, even if the victim succumbed to smoke inhalation before being burnt, it would still have been a horrible death. Struggling to breathe and trying to escape would be terrifying for the young child. The community of Russellville was divided. Some thought death was too harsh. Others believed nothing less could bring justice for Mason. Christy was sent to the Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women, becoming the 3rd woman condemned to death row in Alabama since 2002. Her legal team launched appeal after appeal, but one by one, they were rejected by the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals and even by the Supreme Court of the United States. The law changed in 2017, abolishing judicial override, but it wasn't retroactive. Christy's sentence remained. Today, she still sits on death row. A mother who burnt everything down for greed, a case that still sends chills through Alabama. But as her story ends, this journey through America's death row women draws closer to its final stop. One last woman, one last night of horror, and a crime so shocking it still echoes through the years. She was a mother, a woman who, at one point, tucked her children into bed at night, kissed their foreheads, and told them she loved them. But on one October night in 1997, that same woman turned their home into a killing ground. What happened inside that small house on Barham Drive would leave a community shattered and the nation struggling to understand how a mother could do the unthinkable. This is the story of Susan Eubanks. She was 33 years old. the mother of 4 boys. Brandon, the oldest at 14, had just started navigating teenage years. Austin was 7, full of energy and mischief. Brigham, 6, was the quiet one with the soft smile. And Matthew, just 4 years old, was the baby of the family. To neighbors, Susan's life seemed messy, but not monstrous. She'd been through divorces, custody disputes, and rocky relationships. But who hasn't known someone going through hard times? No one around her could have imagined how that pain would erupt. The day started like so many others, until it didn't. Susan had spent the afternoon drinking with her boyfriend, swallowing Valium and simmering in anger. The two fought bitterly. She slashed his tires, locked him out of the house, and called her estranged husband's friend with a chilling declaration she was going to end her life and take the boys with her. The line between anger and destruction blurred and then disappeared entirely. Inside the house, the boys were unaware of the storm building around them. They had no idea that the woman they called Mom had made up her mind. They couldn't have known that every laugh, every breath they took that night would be their last. When officers finally forced their way into the home, they were met with a nightmare no one forgets. Each boy had been shot in the head. Brandon, Austin, Brigham, Matthew, the oldest and the youngest, gone in a matter of minutes. 3 of them died instantly. Matthew was still barely alive, his tiny body clinging to a life that had already been stolen from him. He was rushed to the hospital, but there was no miracle waiting. He didn't make it. Susan lay nearby on the floor, bleeding from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the stomach. She lived. Her sons did not. Investigators pieced together the final moments of that night, like fragments of broken glass. She had reloaded between shots. She had penned suicide notes. She'd left a voicemail for her ex-husband with just 2 haunting words: "Say goodbye." Prosecutors would later argue this wasn't a moment of madness. It was revenge, a calculated strike meant to destroy the men who had hurt her, by hurting the children they loved most. At trial, the defense tried to paint a different picture. A woman unraveling under the weight of addiction, depression, and heartbreak. But the prosecution laid bare the timeline, the choices, and the precision of what happened that night. This wasn't an accident. This was intent. Cold, steady, final. The jury didn't take long. In 1999, Susan Eubanks was found guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder. A death sentence followed. She was sent to death row at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, the same place that now holds some of the most infamous female inmates in the country. And as the years went on, her case became a chilling reference point. The mother who killed all 4 of her sons. The aftermath was as heavy as the crime itself. 3 of the boys, Austin, Brigham, and Matthew, were buried side by side in graves marked only by fading concrete plaques. No marble headstones, no lavish tributes, just quiet markers for 4 short lives that never got the chance to grow. For the people who still visit their graves, time hasn't erased anything. It hasn't dulled the horror. It hasn't filled the empty spaces left behind. Susan Eubanks remains on death row to this day, living out her years in a place surrounded by steel, barbed wire, and silence. She's one of the few women in America to receive the ultimate punishment, not for killing a stranger, but for killing her own children. And no matter how much time passes, this case lingers like a scar, because it forces us to confront a question many are too afraid to ask. How does love twist into something so fatal? This is the 6th and final story in our journey through the lives of women condemned to die. 6 women. 6 crimes that shook their communities. 6 stories that continue to echo long after the headlines faded. From the desperate, the calculating, and the remorseless to the ones who still claim innocence, each case holds a different kind of darkness. But even as we close this chapter, their stories remind us that beneath every headline is a tangled mess of pain, fear, rage, and choices that can never be undone. If you've followed this series from the first case to this very moment, you know it's not just about the crimes themselves, it's about the human emotions that led to them and the lives that were caught in the crossfire. If you found this story gripping, don't let it end here. Tap that like button, share this video with someone who loves true crime, and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Click on the videos and playlists now showing on your screen to keep the story going. This has been MURK Files, where the darkness is never far away. Stay curious, stay safe.